Hi, Claire here talking about dynamic emergence. Today we're going to actually talk about how to have a successful meeting. I know most of you who are watching this have probably sat through far too many meetings already in your lifetime. This is geared towards any kind of situation. It's particular perhaps to organisations, communities and businesses, but it is equally relevant to personal interactions or facilitated dialogues, or any kind of conflict resolution as well is part of this. And there are certain things that we're going to cover, so I'm going to write those up here. We're going to look at what do we need to do prior to the meeting even happening. Preparation is key. If we just show up at a meeting, it's mayhem. All sorts of stuff can happen that you don't want to have happen, but you haven't set a container. So in a way, that's what this is for. It's for setting a container. People can feel this. So if you've started any of the other classes already, they know, you know, when you walk into a room, whether or not your time is going to be wasted, whether you're going to start feeling impatient, like you're not using your time well. Preparation is really, really key to that, because then when people come into the meeting, they're immediately confident in you. They're confident that the meeting can be productive. The best self in each person can then show up undistracted, and that is really key. The next thing we're going to look at is how to start a meeting. So starting a meeting. This will vary, of course, depending on your context. So if it sort of depends on how much time you have, but it's always important to be as brief as possible, to be as efficient as possible. So planning ahead, number one, can also help you with how to start a meeting. The next point that you need to consider to have a successful meeting is to define the purpose of it. What is the purpose? What is the purpose of the meeting? And apparently Oprah Winfrey does this at the beginning of her meetings, the ones she goes to. Like, why are we having this meeting? What's the intention? Where do we want to get to? And here it is. The next one, after identifying the purpose of the meeting, we're going to just touch in on where the meeting is happening, whether the location is in person, whether it is online, whether it's just on the phone, a conference call, or a private call between two people, because that affects. There are certain assumptions we make that need to be identified so that we don't frustrate the person on the other end of the phone or the Zoom meeting. So where? What's the next one? Setting intentions. So with setting intentions, that's the part that I just mentioned about Oprah, right? So when you come into the meeting, make sure that everyone that is there is on the same page about why on earth you're in this room in this moment together. Like, what's it for? And what do you need to achieve? That's what the setting intentions is. It's identifying what we need to achieve in order to feel like this was successful. That's it. So set your intentions and stick to them as much as possible unless they prove to be limiting. And that's a decision you can make as a group at that time when that seems to be what's happening. So after we've set intentions, there are certain protocols. So we're going to examine those. And of the protocols, this is kind of an unusual one, but I think it's a pretty cool one. It's to do with who's going to monitor the meeting. So I know we're used to this idea of people taking minutes, right? But I'm not talking about that. Minutes are for tracking data. Tracking data. But monitoring is for tracking flow. And as I said, we're going to come to this. This is just a summary of what we're going to cover. This is so important. We all have styles of listening. So we need to be able to identify if each style of listening is actually being brought into the room, brought into the meeting. Because if it's not, especially if you're a manager, let's think of it from that perspective. Let's say you've got 10 people and 3 of them are introverts. Not to be confused with being shy or anything like that. But there are so many different ways of being present that if we don't accommodate them, we could lose those 3 people. Or if you only accommodate those 3 people who are introverts, you might lose 7 other people. And it's just something that over time we can begin to identify. And this relates to the inner res. In terms of like the different styles we have of doing anything, actually. But anyway, you need every voice. Otherwise, why have them in the meeting? What's the point? Don't use their time if you're not going to use their voice. And then the last one, not surprisingly, is ending a meeting. It's an important thing to do. When you have a meeting, you've opened a container. So when you close the meeting, you need to close the energetic container. That's part of this person's job, to monitor whether that's being done well. But you also need to set tasks, actions, deliverables, next steps, depending on the context. If it's a romantic or rather a spousal issue, then obviously you're not going to have deliverables. That's a business term. But you will perhaps have next steps in terms of talking to lawyers or talking to family, and then coming back together to review what you discovered. So that's the outline. Having a meeting. Having a successful meeting. All right. So I will see you shortly. I'm going to clear the board. Then we're going to go into each of these elements to check out exactly what they're made of. All right, thank you. Okay, so here we go. Prior to the meeting, what are the things we need to do? What are the action steps? The first thing you're going to have to do is share an agenda, or share the agenda. And just make sure that everyone who is attending the meeting has received that, so they know what the meeting's for, and whether or not they're going to be needing to present something for that, so that they can be prepared. The second point on action steps for prior to the meeting is share information and documents. Anyone that's going to be at the meeting needs to be on the same page. They need to review the same information. If there's a lot of information, you of course could prioritize it. You could say these are essential reviews, and then this is supplementary. And if you want to be involved in this discussion, which is at this point on the agenda, then you'll need to read these supplemental texts. Obviously, no one has a lot of time available. We live in a very fast, busy world. But the way to, again, show up for maximum efficiency and to avoid any confusion for any of the participants of the meeting, make sure they have all the salient information up front before they come. And I'm not talking 5 minutes before they come. That is not helpful. It needs to be, I would say, at a minimum 24 hours. Give people the time. They have a life, right? So when they leave the office, if this is a business-related issue, they're going to do other things. They should be doing other things to be healthy, to be able to show up with a fresh mind and good imagination. So share information, and I would say 24 hours in advance. And if you can't do it that far in advance, don't get angry if they can't show up in a way that feels to you prepared. So how you handle the preparation prior to the meeting is a really important and meaningful influence on the quality of the meeting itself, the results you're going to be able to anticipate, and what you should be able to ethically accept or expect from the people in the meeting. The final one is timing. Make sure people know what time the meeting's happening. Make sure people know how long the meeting is going to be. That way, people can plan their other meetings, and they're not going to be distracted or concerned or in any way anxious. So just think of it this way. The more information you give people without drowning them, succinct, precise information you can give people ahead of time, the more easily they can show up in a way that they can really listen. They can hear what's happening, they can contribute what they need to, and then move on. So that is the first one, prior to the meeting. So I'm going to clear the board and we'll go to the second one, which is starting a meeting. See you in a minute. Okay, so now we're going to look at starting the meeting. This is a short one. So what do we want to say here? So action steps. Review the agenda. Everyone got one. Have some extra copies with you, or just the digital format, however you're seeing that. Just make sure everyone can place their eyes on the agenda, review it, and see if there are any edits, any additions, that kind of thing. So review the agenda. The other thing you want to do, in fact, is hear each voice. So all that means, here's a for instance, you can do this in different ways. Let's imagine you've got 5 people in the meeting. You could just have everyone put their first names in the hat. You know, I'm Claire, faculty, I'm here to contribute, ... And just go around each person. You could even turn it into sort of a game and just have people say an adjective that describes how they're feeling right now or their favourite colour, anything at all. The purpose of that is not exactly the content as much as it is the voice. When a person puts their voice into a group, when all the people in the group put their voice in, there's a presence that happens that matters. If you don't have that investment of each person putting an aspect of their physicality, the voice is physical as well as emotional, that physicality, once it's put into the room deliberately and witnessed deliberately, there's an investment from each person, both to themselves for doing so and to each other for hearing that person show up. So if you don't do something like that, then that is when people tend to wander off in their minds because there's a part of them that never really committed to being there. So that's how important it is. As a sound healer and someone that works with sound, a musician, I'm really conscious of things like that, and I see it. I watch and see exactly how that plays out. So get people on your side, get people invested in the meeting. Voice. The other thing is appreciation. And remember, these things can take less than 2 minutes. This whole thing can take less than 2 minutes. Apart from that, that might take longer. Appreciation, you just want to say thanks to everyone. People respond positively to appreciation. So if you just say thank you for being at the meeting, I know we're all busy, it's great to see you, let's dive in. That's it. That took 10 seconds. I've appreciated. People will respond. I would also say people will rise. Honestly, humans, we are so ambitious to contribute, to do well. We rise to any kind of invitation to show up as our best self. And that's why it's so important in leadership, to have leaders that inspire us and appreciate us and see our potential. That's how you get the best of us to show up. And I don't mean the best of us compared to others, the best within each of us. So that's how to start the meeting. You can do variations on this theme, but just bear in mind the essence of why I'm mentioning these, and you'll find a style that suits you because you've got your own personality. And you also got your own team of people. And so each team is going to respond to their own aesthetic, your own sort of culture of work. All right, I will clear this up and we will move to the next one, which is checking in. This comes back to purpose on why we have meetings. Okay, so now we're on the subject of why we have meetings and where do we have them, because context actually dictates also certain protocols, which we'll be going into shortly. The only thing on why we have meetings is because why do you ever go to a meeting? Why do you ever hold a meeting? You're trying to get somewhere, aren't you? You're trying to get from A to B. So the success of the meeting, if you think of this as a journey in a car, so what do you need in your car to make sure that you can actually get successfully to your destination? You need gas, it needs wheels, tires, it needs everything, right? And then you can get in the car and you don't just sit in the car waiting for it to do something, you drive the car. So you are the driver of a meeting. That doesn't necessarily have to mean that you run the whole thing. It just means that somebody has to hold the space and set the intentions, which you then agree on. And we have meetings to try and get somewhere. So in terms of that, by definition, a successful meeting means that we arrive at a mutually beneficial and copacetic place or destination. So the where do we do this? We do this in, as we said earlier, phone calls, in conversations. So again, this isn't just for business meetings. It can be personal interactions. But we're trying to get somewhere. So anywhere that you are, you could be having a meeting. You could be in an elevator, you could be on an airplane. As I said, you could be on the phone, you could be on Zoom. All of these you have to kind of start to consider what are the contexts, what faculties do we have access to or not have access to, depending on these different locations for a meeting. And that adjusts the protocols that would go with that to make the meeting successful. Okay. Setting intentions. Very, very key to efficiency and focus. Which in turn leads to productivity and a happy team. So setting intentions. What's an intention? Intention is a statement of intent. It's a desire to be in a certain place, that A to B. It's how are we going to get from A to B. It's what do we want B to look like, be like, sound like, feel like, cost, whatever it is. So where do we want to get to? By the end of the meeting. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get there or get there with the version that you hoped for. But, that's part of the compromise, isn't it? Of just being in real time with people and variables, the variables of life. So that's what we mean by setting an intention. We need to identify what matters. Identify what matters. So you may need to prioritize. But that's really what the agenda's job is. The agenda's job is to prioritize the essentials and then the secondaries The secondaries being the things that you can add into the dialogue when the essentials feel well met. And it might be that when the essentials are well met, even if you have more time scheduled, that may not be the efficient thing to do. The efficient thing to do as far as managing energy goes might be to let people go so they can just like dive straight in. If they're fired up and excited, you don't want to put them to sleep like in terms of that particular fire and passion just because you've got an agenda that you want to finish. So you have to be flexible around that. Another question is this: what will matter later? And what do I mean by that? So what I mean by that is that the meeting was to deal with some already identified issues or intentions, right? But this is all alchemical. Everything's changing all the time. So then you've had your meeting, you've had input and discovery, dialogue, decisions. But then you'll have a new position. You'll have like going for a walk. You know, you walk up and down the hills or the mountains. Every mountain or hill that you walk up, the view is different. So because you've done this, at that point, there'll be a new view. And you need to decide collectively or have someone who's assigned to make these decisions around what will be upcoming because of what you've discussed so far in the meeting. Because you need to make room for that. You need to kind of anticipate that that's going to need attention. And so incorporate that into your future planning. So now we're actually going to go on to protocols, which is a slightly longer section. Okay, so protocols. And again, this is something I referred to earlier. This will change a little bit depending on the context in terms of your geographical location and whether you're in person or on the phone. So for instance, when you're on the phone, this is a really important one, but it's important in the meeting if you don't know each other. Identify yourself. So when you're on the phone, this is particularly, as I said, important because not everyone knows each other's voices. You often will have visitors or guests in a meeting, perhaps even from another company or just, you know, a different environment. Identify yourself each time you speak. Don't leave people guessing. This is a little bit like painting a painting. Good composition, although it can be intriguing, should not be confusing. The minute you have your audience confused, part of their brain is now off trying to figure out what the pattern is. We're pattern identifiers, humans. That's just what we do. It's part of our reptile brain. It's how we survive in the world when dinosaurs were around, but it's still part of our design. So you've got to keep things as simple as possible in terms of as clear as possible. That does not mean dumb things down. It just means don't leave people guessing. Spell it out. Be very, very clear. I'm actually going to add that in. Be clear. The next part of that is that when you're presenting information, you have to become the person that's about to receive it. And what that means is that you need to communicate your information in a way that anticipates the other person successfully hearing it. If you don't, you really just become something of a megaphone, and you may not even realise that you've lost the other person's attention. You may not realise if you've left them behind because you haven't explained something well enough. Maybe they don't have the history on something. So be the listener. As you speak, because it will give you a more thorough and effective way of transferring information from here to there, from A to B. And then finally on this is to say or indicate, again, clearly, I'm done. Again, this is particularly key for phone calls. If you're in a phone conference, you've identified yourself, fantastic. You've been very clear and articulate, excellent. Perhaps you've even asked relevant questions, okay? being the listener as you speak. So you make sure that you're considering how easy will this be to follow, how easy will this be to integrate and to understand. Then with the phone, all you have is sound or silence. So it's your job as the speaker of any given moment to let people know, I'm done. And you can do that however you choose to do that, as a team or as individual listeners and speakers, so that everyone else knows that they can now respond or speak into the silence. Because very occasionally we actually have silence while we're thinking about what we're going to say next. If people don't know that you're not done, they're going to think that you are. And so they'll just speak because, you know how people are. We're so impatient to speak into silence. We have no regard for the contemplative power of silence, especially for problem solving. So that deep listening is a big part of our communication, and it should be even more of it. So when you say I'm done, people know, the silence has served its purpose, or we don't need silence because he's already said or she's already said, I'm done. So a question then is, how are you talking? And there's really just a couple of key things here. One of my golden rules is assume intelligence, but do not assume knowledge. What's the distinction? The distinction is that if I assume intelligence in you, for instance, let's say you and I are having a meeting, you're going to feel the respect that you rightly should be having from me, whether we're in a meeting or just a conversation. So assume the respect, assume that this person is intelligent in their own way, in their own unique way, that they have perspectives that are valuable that I can't have because I'm a different person. So you assume intelligence, but not knowledge. What that means is just because someone is intelligent and can bring forth great ideas, that doesn't mean they know everything that you've done to date or thought to date based on the subject that you're sharing with them. So educate, but educate someone that you see as intelligent. Don't educate someone as if they're really missing, some aspect of that capacity to process reality. That's not the case. You just need to find the way that they're going to be able to hear you and keep track of what you're saying so they can follow the progress of your thought and then take it further. That's why you have meetings, because you can't do it all alone. You need a team, and you need all the different ideas and viewpoints in order to develop projects and ideas and plans to successful completions at whatever point they're timetabled for. So the next one is obviously, how are you talking? You can probably guess it's this. How are you listening? Are you paying attention? Are you giving that person 100% of you? Or have you sectioned off 10% to think about your shopping list, 20% to think about your ambitions to have that person's job, whatever it might be? If it's, a facilitated dialogue, when you're listening, are you listening just because you want to find out when the person's going to stop talking so that you can start talking? Are you listening because you want to hear? Or are you listening because it's polite? Are you listening because you have to? It is incumbent on both parties to find the reasons, and this is why intention is so important at the beginning, to find the reasons that you're there, to stay attuned to those reasons, to reaffirm those reasons. Because our minds are just famous for wandering. So we have to keep bringing it back. So the quality of our listening directly impacts the quality of what can be discovered next, what can be understood next, what can be revealed next. And we impact that by the quality of our listening. The quality of our listening engenders trust or distrust in the person sharing. We're very quick to know, because we read energy, because we have this RES, because we're capable of feeling energy, and then we'll have emotional reactions, and then we'll do some analysis. We can tell if you're fully present or not. And sometimes even at a party, I might be chatting to somebody and they're telling me something, and then I realise I wandered off, just benignly wandered off. I nearly always say to that person, actually, I've got to admit, for a moment there, my mind just disappeared and I've just realised it. So I missed the last few things that you said, the last sentence or two. Would you mind repeating it? I really want to hear what you said, because I'm engaged in this conversation and I'm so sorry that I disappeared. It's just being human, force of habit. And it's no reflection on you. It's no reflection on what you were saying. Now, of course, it might be a reflection on what they were saying, but again, we have to find how to see something as interesting even when we're having trouble. We have to find out how to make something relevant even when we can't see its relevance. It might mean asking more questions so that you can form a relationship and a bridge between what they're talking about and what you care about. It's your job. It's your job to show up in a way that helps the other person show up even better. If we all come in with that attitude, can you imagine what kind of problem solving we can do and how compassionate it would feel? So it's really never the other person's job to kind of force our interest. It's our job to make them the most important person we're listening to each time. Whatever we have that's important to say in response, you could jot down keywords if you need to so that you don't lose track. But more important than that even is that whatever matters that you have to bring to the table will come forward. Even if you forget it in that moment, it will re-present itself because important things tend to do that. The less important things, it doesn't matter really if they don't come back. So have some trust. Trust the process. Trust your process. Okay. So in order to listen well, you have to want to hear. Are you willing to learn? Are you so arrogant that you think you know it all, and therefore what a waste of time it is to have to listen to this person? Or are you capable of recognizing beginner's mind, the value of it? And beginner's mind is simply this idea that if you have a cup that is full, you cannot add to it. If you empty the cup, it doesn't mean you drain away your knowledge. It means that you show up with the excitement, with the anticipation that you could actually learn from this other person. It's a wonderful way to develop your natural respectfulness of others and of that which we do not yet know. So beginner's mind is a really, really wonderful way to show up and learn from other people. When we do that, again, we bring the best forward of that other person. Anytime we're respected, the best of us can show up. It just melts us. It's a human thing. Finally, unexamined assumptions. What are your unexamined assumptions? Why does that matter? What does it mean? This is particularly important when it comes to bias. We're so biased. Humans are so riddled with bias, whether it shows up as sexism or patriarchy or racism or homophobia. We're so full of so many misassumptions about people because we have this sort of rigid structure, which is why we're doing dynamic emergence, because we're actually by nature fluid. But the minute we make a decision, we crystallize our energy field. And then it loses that magical flow. It loses the ability to learn. Don't do that. Don't lose your ability to learn. It's the most important faculty that you have. So exploring unexamined assumptions, one of the ways we can do that in the meeting itself in real time is whenever someone uses a term, especially if you see a reaction happen, have the person define their terminology. Not because you're putting them on the spot, but because you're trying to create a platform that everyone can feel comfortable seeing and sitting in and exchanging in. So one person might use a word that for them is a positive, but for others it could be a really negative connotation. You know, it could carry negative connotation. When that happens, because of this, and because of our storytelling capacity, we'll disappear. We'll stop listening, we'll stop hearing, because we don't think that person's safe anymore. It really just takes one unexamined assumption, unexplored dialogue to shut down a whole meeting. And you might have been this close to an amazing resolution. If you think about all the restorative justice work in particular, I mean, you think about politics and how many violations politics in America alone has created since its inception, post-Indigenous Native American inhabitants of the land. It's just, it's stunning to me that we're not even more violent than we are already. So exploring our unexamined assumptions is just, it's safe. It's the safe thing to do. It shows, again, this respect. We need to have respect, and taking the time to ask people questions, to learn, and to be a really good listener. In a way, that's kind of how you identify yourself. Although that was a different form of identification I was talking about there. But when you can show who you can really be, that's another way of identifying yourself. People will remember you for that. And they'll remember you well. Has to be authentic, but it's a really, really good thing to start to practice. So the next one we're going to go on to is monitoring the flow of the meeting. And this really directly relates to rational, emotional, and sensory. So here we are. Now we're going to be looking at monitoring the flow. And this is where we're really getting into the special nature of dynamic emergence. This is its real work right here. So monitoring the flow or energy of the meeting. What does that mean? What do you think it means? I'm going to have to go here. RES. Rational, emotional, and sensory. Now, each of us, and you've either watched or will be watching videos that talk about this in more detail with some really helpful examples and ways for you to develop each of these different ways of knowing. So each person who has an emphasis in one of these areas could actually be given the job, and we'll call it the keeper of a particular realm. So I'll just put it like this, keeper of the realm. That keeper will use their skill to monitor the flow and the energy of the meeting. Why do we do that? We do that because it's not just about data that you can type in. It's about the quality of attention that people are giving, which will directly affect their productivity. If it's a romantic or the opposite of romantic, intimate dialogue that's being facilitated between two people, that energy of attention can be really challenging. And so you kind of have to stay awake to each other to make sure that you're not getting overloaded or having trouble staying present. When we get emotionally triggered, really what we tend to want to do is just disappear as fast as possible away from the source of the trigger, even though the source is in us, we identify it outside of us in the other person. So keepers of the realm, of each realm, this realm, this realm, this realm, rational, emotional, sensory. So let's look at a sensory keeper. What might they keep track of? So they monitor, as I mentioned, energy quality, inclusivity, making sure everyone's being included, and contributions. Everyone has something to contribute. It's not really ours to evaluate whether or not the scale of it is the right size, because we don't ever really know in a living system, all these different moving parts, everything has its place, everything has its moment. So it's the smallest tweak or suggestion, or even the voice of the person making it, could be the thing that shifts things to a new level. And you always want to be looking for that in these meetings. You want to let the energy rise. You want to support it as best you can by helping it rise, which means, by the way, avoiding certain traits like sarcasm or criticism or flattening people's ideas before they've had a chance to really develop through dialogue. Now the other is to do with this. I mentioned this earlier, silence, protecting the silence. What that means is that someone who has a good sensory aptitude, it means that, you know, a meeting is musical, and it means that this person, who's the sort of the keeper of the sensory realm, we could say, you could name it anything you like, they know the importance of allowing for a pause. You just have to let things gestate. You have to let them sit visible in the silence. They have a way then of traveling inside of you and generating, as if almost in a dream state, a new thought or a new correlation, association between different ideas. So these are jobs that different people, you could have 3 different people doing these jobs. So let's look at the emotional one. Who tracks attention, focus. They're all about attention in a way. Focus, clarity, engagement, productivity. Our emotional state dictates our mental acuity. It's very hard to be mentally clear if we're emotionally charged. So a person who's good at emotions can watch the dynamics going on between the participants, monitor them, and even with a few little questions or even a shifting of body language, turning your attention, turning your physicality, your sensory towards the person that's talking, anything like that, that's another way of communicating information. Watching the flow, where's flow gone? Watching the flow of the dynamics is really the job of all 3 of these people, but in this one, the subtle realms of the emotional they take a different kind of focus, a different type of person who can actually watch that and see the meaning that's unfolding, and to help nurture it back or redirect it a little bit if needs be. Okay, finally, rational. This is an easy one. There's a flow of time as much as there's a flow of the quality of energy. So the person in charge of time management, that person could be the person that's watching the agenda, which, by the way, should be timed, ideally, even with an estimate, like this might take 5 minutes, this might take 2 minutes, this might take 10 or 15 minutes, and just estimate ahead of time. That's in the pre-meeting agenda creation. So the person with a rational bias or emphasis is an ideal candidate to be the keeper of the time realm. And they can just monitor what's going on, whether you're keeping track, and then obviously the most helpful way to not interrupt the flow and yet keep people on time is to say, okay, we actually allocated about 10 minutes for this topic. We've got 3 more topics to go. So all very rational, very clear. 3 topics to go. We're going to be short 5 minutes. Even if we stop right now, we're going to be short 5 minutes for these 3. These are the topics. Do we want to keep going with this and push this last topic on to our next meeting? And you just very, very quickly take a quick vote. And that way you make sure that the new priority gets its time. So the final piece I want to add here, which is just, it kind of depends on the context that you're having the meeting in, but that could be really fun to just invite in your imagination to have more creative play. Each of these ways of knowing could be associated, each of these tasks in particular, could be associated with particular god or goddess, Greek. So I'm going to tell you who they are. So the one of time in this context is actually kairos, hence chirological time. And the emotional goddess is actually Athena. So you could kind of just take on this sort of persona internally even to give your sense of import with the task you have extra weight and to make it more real for you rather than just some sort of thing you're doing whilst you're at work in a meeting. So Athena is the goddess connected to the emotional realms. And finally, sensory has a god and a goddess that I have picked out who feel like a good match for this role. And that is both Rhea, R-H-E-A, and Kairos. That's K-A, write that again down here. Kairos and Rhea. What I'm going to do is actually, in the notes below the video, you will see a little bit of an explanation about the various gods and goddesses I've mentioned here. I'm not going to go into them right now. But you'll see from that why they're an appropriate choice. So the next video we're going to go into styles of listening, which again, especially for the hosts of the meeting, very important that you have an understanding of the different types of personalities and skill sets that you need to both incorporate and accommodate. So I will see you on the next section, styles of listening. Okay, so styles of listening. You might be surprised how many different ways there are of taking in information and processing it. It can be affected by culture, gender, personal history, education, geography, age, like just so many. What era are you in? All of these things affect our style of listening. What species you are, of course. We're dealing with humans at the moment. So let's just see how it is. So for emotional people, we feel our listening. Emotionally. And to whatever degree you relate to your own emotional skill sets and experiencing, you know how cloudy things can become when we're emotionally charged. So, but it's also about language. So identifying an emotional listener, we tend to speak with language such as I feel. Most of our sentences start with I feel. And just know who they are in your team for the benefit of the productivity itself, and incorporating people and making sure everyone feels valued and present. So with rational people with a rational bias or emphasis, we analyze our listening. So we take in data and we reorganize it and repattern it and make decisions about how to meet, if it's a problem, how to meet the problem, if we need to make associations. We're doing that while we're listening. It's a great skill set, both of them great skill sets. Finally, we have the sensory. So I'm putting sensorially, I could also put energetically. Three fantastic ways of knowing that we have, each of us have all three. To different degrees, each of us use all three. And these are styles of listening that need to be met in particular ways to really maximize what's available through these three gateways So for instance, with emotional listening, we have empathic. Empathic listening. There's lots of ways to get more experience in terms of empathic. You can do empathic circles, like you can find all sorts of empathy circles where you can practice empathic listening. If you're a manager or just in a relationship, you know, or in a community, maybe you're a community leader, maybe you work in a church, or, you know, you're part of some kind of advisory committee. To be able to listen empathically is its own skill. It's a big deal to be able to do that. Involve mirroring and witnessing and listening for what is not being said through what is being said. That's empathic listening. So it's really quite something. It's a particular way of paying attention to a person's expressions and their body language, which would come under here, to find out what's the most important thing for or to this person right now as they speak. So that's empathic listening. Then in terms of the more rational, we have NVC, non-violent communication. That's one. And then one that I'm kind of making up, to be honest, because it's real, but it's not really named, is pattern listening. So what do I mean when I'm saying pattern listening? Pattern listening is, as I was saying here, a very rational skill. It means that everything I'm saying as a speaker, I'm revealing something about how I see the world. I'm revealing whether I feel it's benign or whether I feel it's oppressive, whether I feel safe, whether I feel valued, whether I feel like I have value. These are subtle, these are all to do with our belief systems, and that's to do with how we grew up and how we processed information growing up from our environment. Pattern listening is something that you can do. You can practice listening to people to see if you can identify some of their most basic psychological structures. And when you can do that, you can see how you can help a person feel safe enough to really give the best of themselves in a meeting or in a facilitation or whatever the situation is. So pattern listening, I'm putting that under rational listening because it is a very analytical thing to do, but you're actually doing it. You can do it with your empathy, or you can just do it purely from a purely kind of theoretical perspective. But when you actually put all three of these skills, sensory, rational, and emotional, together, you get a gestalt that really is just has a great value in being able to support people and support an outcome that you're hoping to achieve together. So a sensory listening, I've actually got three here, and they're all quite rich. So we have deep listening, and I'm putting them in different colours to associate with the different ways of knowing. Deep listening, this again is a new one for me that I'm adding that feels really important and timely. Cultural listening, and then flow and energy listening, which we touched on in the previous video. Deep listening is, again, as I've mentioned before, deep listening relates to appreciating the silence. And not thinking of silence as the absence of sound, but think of silence as the pausing of information sharing in order for a certain assimilation or integration to occur. That creates new knowledge. So it's not the end of the process, it's actually just a different phase of processing. So someone expresses something, we take it in deeply. What does that mean again? It means that we take it in a way that feels the deep ecology of the situation. That means that there is a part of us, especially because this is sensorial, so we're dealing with energy here, as well as physicality. It means that we have an appreciation that there is a body talking, and not just this body, but a collective of aliveness that is speaking. So that can be our ancestry, it can be our hopes, dreams and fears, it can be our relationships, it can be our work experience, it can be a deep wisdom that's coming from the planet herself, which is always available. So the deep ecology, the silence, the deep listening, this is just a way to listen for wisdom. Something we need very badly right now is to access human wisdom. Human wisdom is something that we get from connecting to the other realms. Remember, this is an inter-realmic system. Dynamic emergence is inter-realmic, and that means every realm, whether it's collective consciousness, planetary consciousness, infinite consciousness, inner res, outer res, there is communication happening. The more we are able to practice deep ecology, deep listening, the more we get to draw on and be informed by superior levels of wisdom that have a more of an overview of what's going on. Okay? Cultural listening is pretty self-explanatory. It means educating ourselves to understand other cultures, to understand what offends, to understand their history, most likely of oppression. If you're not white, you've probably been oppressed, is basically what we're looking at these days. The more we understand the history of white males and settlers, colonizers, these different ways of transferring across continents, and how we did that to such negation of culture, to be able to listen with a cultural sensibility means that you took the time to honor and respect another culture. It means you took the time to learn how to not offend. And these are lifelong things. Every culture has its trigger points, as well as every individual within each culture, white included. So just pay respect to the traditions of each culture that are present at your meeting. If you can do that, it might slow the meeting down a little bit. It might increase your learning curve. But my goodness, what a team you'd have. So include every voice, include every sensibility, and you will create a diverse, powerful team, a diverse, powerful community. And very finally, the flow and energy listening that we have talked about, that's simply tracking energy as it's moving, tracking whether it's rising or falling, whether it's retracting or expanding. Therein lies the creativity, therein lies the creative potential for realizing new ideas, new ways forward in sympathy with one another. Okay. One thing you can do that's really important in terms of how does this show up in language is asking questions. All right, so let's go here. So we're going to ask questions. You can ask questions that open a dialogue or a meeting. You can ask questions or make statements that close it. So right now we're looking at questions that open or expand. And it's things like this. What if? What if ... Or yes, that's an interesting idea. How about if we, what do you think of? I'm wondering, so all of these are written down underneath the video, but as a shorthand, I'm just going to put that one. What if? And it's so enticing. You can feel how the energy of the dynamics change because you're asking questions of invitation. You're going to invite new insight and sharing. And you really want that. You want people to share what they know. You want people to share what their ideas are, what their questions are, what their thoughts are. If you don't want them to do that, why are they in the meeting? So include the people, have the people that need to be there and let them speak. So invite them, like, what if? How do you feel about? We're feeling our listening. How do you feel about that? John, Peter, Mary, Susie. How do you perceive that? John, Mary, Peter, Susie. Like, what would you do with that? And then again, finally, you know, what do you feel, how do you feel that influences the possibilities? Do you feel like it's expanding things or not? And these are the questions you could ask the keepers too. Okay. Very finally on this, the not to-dos, okay? Very important. If you want people to come back, keep coming back and sharing good ideas and exploring ideas together, here's what you don't do. You don't do sarcasm. You don't do disrespect. And you don't shut down. What does that one mean? It means that if someone's exploring an idea, especially if it's tentatively, if you're hosting the meeting, or even if you're just another one of the participants, you don't shut down someone's idea, you explore it. So if you don't get why someone's proposing something, that's on you to help them explain it in a way that you can. So it's fine to keep asking someone. You could ask 2, 3, 4 times, I'm still not getting it. Is there another way you can share this with me? Because I'd really like to understand the idea, and maybe we'll need to carry on chatting about this outside the meeting. But anytime anyone does one of these 3 things, and worse, you know, there are other ways to be, well, to disrespect, you know, or to shame people. Let's add that one. Or belittle. If you do any of those, well, of course, you shouldn't be doing the job you're doing if you're hosting the meeting. But apart from that, it's just energetically, if you look at the fields of influence mind maps that I've done, you're either expanding the energy or you're contracting it. And then as far as the collective consciousness goes, the part that we share together that's about our potential, that kind of expands and reduces the level of the ceiling for what we can do creatively together. Any of these things, it's like a pin in a balloon. It's just like, just completely kills the investment that people might have made up to that point. If it's not a safe place to have a meeting, then you can be pretty much guaranteed, if that's going on, none of this is going on. And I'm not really sure about the longevity of any relationship that favours this or allows this over any of this. So one of the most important things we're here to be as humans is kind. And one of the advantages of today's administration in the US government is they're showing us what it looks like when you're not. And how much chaos that creates, how much lack of cohesion it creates. It sort of blasts people to such opposite ends of spectrums that we didn't even know we had. So kindness is really one of the most important things to bring in. You can be efficient and kind at the same time. Being kind does not mean you suddenly turn from the hare to the turtle. It just means that you are showing up in a way that respects life. So the very final piece I'm going to do on this is ending a meeting, which is very short. So I'll be back in 1 minute. Hi. So we're going to finish off now with how to end a meeting. The reason I'm doing this is because I was recently in a meeting that one of the participants, I was facilitating a dialogue between 2 people that were in conflict, and one of them just left. He couldn't handle it. He got to a point emotionally where he was just very triggered. So he left the meeting without any kind of closure. That was very difficult for the remaining person and for me, to be honest, because we were holding a container and had done for almost 3 hours. And then suddenly to have that almost kind of ripped out, and sort of stretched away from us, as it were, following the person who left, it made me realise that it's really important that we have an agreement about how to end a meeting, including what happens if one of us gets triggered. So this is maybe more of a facilitator's one. There are elements I will touch on to do with a business meeting. But to end a meeting well, I think requires a return to appreciation. In this case, the way I managed that situation is that I did an appreciation email because it was my only available option, really. We weren't in person anymore. So it's like, okay, what's the next best thing? So I did an appreciation of how hard it is to do restorative work and encourage them to keep going, you know. So appreciation, and if this is a business meeting, appreciate people's time, appreciate their knowledge, wisdom, skill sharing, and so on. So basically, thank you for coming, right? The next thing you do is you identify or review, because you may have already done this during the meeting. Action steps. That includes who's responsible, for what, and by when. Check that everyone has spoken. So hold the space open. Is there anything anyone else would like to add, especially anyone that may not have spoken yet? And if you need to, because sometimes in classes I need to do this because of some people who already are shy, I will ask them directly by name. You know, Joe, is there anything else you'd like to add? We'd really love a contribution from you. So, you know, and ask what you want to ask. Don't just make something up. So have all voices been heard? And so we've got action steps, similar, but not necessarily exactly the same. Identify deliverables. And again, what, where, and who's responsible. Also method. So that would include whether we're doing this through email, whether we're going to just have a Google Doc, or maybe you use some kind of a system, teamwork or something at your place of work. If it's something more personal, it might be that the deliverable could be I'm going to do some self-reflective journaling on a question that came up today for both of us. And so when we next meet, next week, for instance, if it's a weekly thing, I'm going to be sharing what I discover through that time with myself, through that contemplation when we meet next. And that might be true for both of you. And then finally, is there any follow-up? Like, are there things that members of the group, members of the conversation or the dialogue, members of the community, members of the team, each person might have something that needs some follow-up that was already decided in the meeting. So these are similar. So number 2, identifying action steps. Number 4, identifying deliverables. And number 5, any follow-up. They're really closely related, but they are somewhat distinct. Yeah, the final thing I want to say, because of how I started this piece, is try to finish together. If one of you knows you're going to a meeting and you know you're going to be leaving before it's finished, it's a really, really respectful thing to do to mention that before you begin. So as you go around the table, perhaps if you're just putting your name into the room or in your department, you could say, apologies, I will be leaving 15 minutes early. And obviously do so quietly so that you don't interrupt the flow. You don't say goodbye again when you're leaving the meeting because, there's something happening. So you exit quietly and let that carry on. And then part of the follow-up might be an email summary of minutes, for instance, if this is business. And in teams that I've worked with, when we get that, we're invited to edit the minutes, to add things that were left out, or edit things that we recognised ourselves as having said but slightly differently. So that's a decision you guys have to make in each setting that you find yourselves in. So that is it. If you take any of this on board in terms of how you might adapt or alter the way you do meetings, my hope is that it will help enhance the trust, the coherence, the cohesion, and the productivity in the most creative ways. Like, the point to me of a meeting, what makes a meeting successful to me, is one where people feel glad they went. Not just because it was fun and chatty, but because it was inspiring, because it helped re-identify and redirect the focus, because it felt productive. Most people want a meeting to feel productive. So the more you plan before and after, then the context, the container has been bookended. And that's a really, really good place to start from. So I hope you found this useful, and I look forward to seeing you in other videos. This is Dynamic Emergence, and again, I am Claire Hedin. Thank you for being here.